Hello and welcome to another episode of Coffee with Thorben. As every Friday, 3 p.m. CET, we are meeting here to talk about Java, persistence, Hibernate, all these kinds of things. I already saw Deepak in the chat. Hi, Deepak. Nice to have you. Also, welcome to everyone else. I hope you brought a few questions for the Q&A part. And I will start this stream with a topic that I get asked really often about, and that one is addressing the, well, I would say, almost say confusion that a lot of developers have when we talk about the different ways to define queries with JPA and Hibernate. And I get it. It looks like we have three ways to do exactly the same. We have JPQL queries, we have native SQL queries, and we have the criteria API. And well, it's a valid question to ask, why do we need three different ways to do seemingly the same thing? The main answer to that is these three APIs don't do the same thing. They do similar things, but not the same. Each and every query API there has its own benefits, and we will talk about that in today's stream. Okay, so let's get into this. Yeah, we have three different query APIs. JPQL queries, which is a query language defined by the JPA specification that is based on your domain model. So based on your entity classes and all the associations that you map there and all other mapping informations. So there you stay in the same context that you have when you're working with your entity objects. Then we have the criteria API. One important thing, JPQL is string-based and its syntax is very similar to SQL, but based on the domain model, not based on the table model. Then we have the criteria API, which supports the same feature set as JPQL, but provides them as a Java API. So a bunch of interfaces and classes that you can use to define your queries. And then we have native SQL queries, which is just the standard SQL statement that you would send to your database if you would be using plain JDBC, or if you are using pgadmin or any other tool to directly go into your database and extract data there, or to monitor what's actually going on when you're working with the database. Yeah, let's talk about the JPQL part first. What makes JPQL special? Two things, basically three things make JPQL special. First of all, it's based on your domain model, as I said before. So you don't need to think about table names, column names, how do all these tables work together, which are the different key columns, and how do you join them, and so on. Because all of these information are already part of your mapping information of your entity classes. And with JPQL, you can reuse that and don't need to write an SQL statement that works on the table model. The second advantage is that JPQL is independent of your database. If you're working with multiple databases and try to write native SQL statements, you probably already recognize that all of them claim to provide an SQL interface and to support SQL. But if you look at the SQL statements that these databases can process, you will quickly recognize that even though all of them are working with SQL, all of them are using a slightly different flavor of SQL, which is really annoying, let's be honest. Because that means that you need to adapt your SQL statements to each and every RDBMS. But not if you're using JPQL. With JPQL, you have this abstraction layer and then Hibernate or any other JPA implementation generates the SQL statements and takes care of the different flavors of SQL that are supported. But to achieve that, your persistence provider, in our case Hibernate, needs to understand the JPQL statement and needs to be able to generate the SQL statement. And due to that, the supported feature set that you can use in JPQL depends on the features that Hibernate supports and that are way less than supported by your database, which results in a query language that isn't as powerful as SQL. But that doesn't mean that you can't do interesting things with it. Let's go into the IDE and take a quick look at this. So you can see here a typical JPQL statement. As you can see, this is very similar to SQL, but it's not the same. So now here I'm working on the book entity class instead of the book table, and Hibernate reuses all the mapping information from here. And besides that, that looks very similar to SQL. If you're able to read SQL statements, if you're really familiar with SQL, you will not have any issues with JPQL. And if we run this query, then you will see that we get an SQL statement down here that was generated by Hibernate. And there are a few important differences due to the fact that we now need an SQL statement that works on the table model. And the database, for example, doesn't know our book entity class. So in JPQL, we can select B, which is a book entity object, but the database actually doesn't know what that means. And because of that, Hibernate then generates an SQL statement that selects all database columns that are mapped by the entity attributes. And you can use the same for, as I said, for joins and all other kinds of things. And we also have database functions, as you know from SQL. All of this is supported by Hibernate or any other JPA implementation. If you want to dive deeper into that, you find on torbenjansen.com/live more resources about this, including an extensive guide on JPQL, where I explain what kind of database functions there are and how to call custom functions and all these kinds of things. Let me quickly catch up with the chat here. So welcome everyone. I see quite a few people there joining the chat. And there's a question from Turab. And he asks, does Criteria API protect us from SQL injection? Yes. Well, yes and no. All queries or supported types of queries with Hibernate protect you from SQL injection if you're using them in the right way. And using them in the right way means that you need to use bind parameters. So we see that here. We have a so-called named bind parameter, which is called title. So this identifies a named bind parameter. And this is the name of the named bind parameter. And then we can set it in the next line, where I call the setParameter method on my typed query. And I set it to %Hibernate%. So this would be called an ad hoc JPQL query. We can do the same with a named JPQL query. So there we have an entity class that we annotate with named query. And there we give that thing a name because it's called a named query. So it obviously has to have a name. And then we set the JPQL query statement. And I have a named bind parameter here that put it as a constant down here. And then in our code, we can just call create named query, provide the name of the query, and set the bind parameter in the same way as we did for the ad hoc JPQL query. So I kept the part about the syntax here real short. I expect that everyone who joined the stream today is at least familiar on a basic level with JPQL. If you have any questions there, please post them in the chat. More than happy to dive deeper if there are any questions. Mortiza, welcome to the stream. Yes, of course, you can ask questions if they are related to the things that I'm showing here right now about the different kinds of queries. I will do my best to answer them immediately. If you have a question that's independent of this, then feel free to post it now, but I will most likely then delay my answer until we got to the Q&A part in the second part of this stream. Okay, then we had JPQA statements as a named or as an ad hoc query. And then we have the criteria API. The criteria API supports the same set of features as JPQL. So both of them support a limited feature set compared to plain SQL, because Hibernate or any other JPA implementation takes the information that we provide via the JPQL statement or via this criteria API calls that I will show you in a few seconds, and generates an SQL statement out of that. And because of that, well, Hibernate needs to support the features, and all of this was intentionally designed on the JPA specification level as a leaky abstraction, with the intention that you can do the most basic and most common things using these APIs, but that you can still use native queries if you need to do the complex stuff. Okay, so I know that criteria API is something that's not that commonly used than JPQL, so we get into a few more details here. How do you create a criteria query? So you get your criteria builder from the entity manager. This is your builder that you will use all over your code to create multiple parts of your query. Then we create a query and we get back a criteria query interface that we then use to build our query. And on that, we define the from clause and we say, okay, we created up here a criteria query that's supposed to return a book. So we start our from clause on the book entity class, and we join from the book to the author's entity using the defined annotation association on our book entity. So if we look here, then we see that we have an author's attribute on the book entity, and it's a many-to-many association. And here we have all the mapping information for the association between the two database tables. And we don't need to provide this information here because they are already available when we reference the association attribute. In this case, I'm not referencing it as a static string. What I'm doing is I'm using the meta model class that's also part of the JPA specification, and that describes that you have a static, an abstract class for each entity class that has the same name as the entity with an added underscore at the end. And this class contains static attributes for each mapped entity attribute. And you can then use it here when you create your query to reference entity attributes. And that makes it way easier to write the query, and it also adds type safety and additional support for refactorings and so on. Okay, so now we have a query that's supposed to return a book. We have a from clause, and now we need to do a few more things. So first of all, in this case, I'm just selecting the book entity. So I'm not defining a select clause. You could, of course, also call the select method on the criteria query to define what we want to select. But in this case, I'm just selecting the book entity that I referenced here and that I start my from clause on. And by default, that works then out of the box. Okay, then I create two parameter expressions for the first name and the last name. and I use them down here to create the where clause. So, and here you see a downside of the criteria API. It gets pretty noisy if you read this here. So we have an AND expression. In that AND, we do an equal comparison on the first name attribute of the author and an equal on the last name of the author. And all of that becomes our AND, our where clause. So as you can see, this is quite a hard to read part, especially if you now create complex where clauses. We have lots of these expressions that you combine. So please do yourself a favor, structure your code well. Maybe take something like this and put it into a variable and then add a comment to it, and then just combine the different parts of your where clause when you create the where clause here. And then I do a little bit of ordering, and then I'm done with the definition of my criteria query, and I call the create query method on the entity manager. And then I can set my bind parameters and execute the query in the same way as I would execute a JPQL query. So as you can see here, for a relatively simple query, so what we did is we have a query that returns all the books written by an author with a given first and last name. That's a relatively simple thing if you would use JPQL or the or native SQL statement. So why should you write this much code here? So there are two reasons why teams use the criteria API. Hello? Okay, I'm back. Can you hear me? Okay, awesome. So yeah, now I can hear myself. Control still tell me that something's down, but it looks like we are back. Awesome. Okay. Where was I? Yeah. So I was talking about why we put so much effort into writing a query using the criteria API if we could do the same using JPQL or a native statement. And there are two reasons for that. It's the added type safety and refactoring support that we get with the JPA meta model and the whole criteria API. And a second reason that I think is way more important, and that is that the criteria API provides you a good way to dynamically create your query, which is really useful if you build your query based on user input. So not just based on, so if your query is not simply defined when you write your code, but when you need to adjust the joins and the attributes or database columns that you compare based on input that you get from the user. Typical scenario for that is you have a huge complex input mask where the user can fill out certain fields, and based on whatever they fill out, you generate the where clause and your overall statement. And in all these situations, the additional flexibility of the criteria API are really, really helpful. In all other cases, it doesn't provide any benefit, and I would suggest that you then better use a JPQA statement if you don't need this flexibility. Okay, now I need to quickly go back into the chat and see what kind of questions you asked. I know that before I got shortly disconnected, there were a few questions in the chat. I will now do my best to find them. I no longer see them here in in my stream admin console, but I should find them here in the chat. Yeah, so Turab asked if the criteria API protects us from SQL injection. Well, in the same way as native, as JPQL does, and that's only if you use these parameter expressions and then set the parameters down here. But then, yes, the criteria API protects you from SQL injection issues. What else do we have? Ambrose asks, hey Thorben, in terms of performance, is criteria API most efficient for speedy return of a data set? Well, that depends. In almost all cases, there are better options than the criteria API. So in all the tests that I did so far, the criteria API was slightly slower on the Hibernate side when you generated the query than a similar JPQL statement. The generated SQL statement then is the same. So you can write the same SQL statement using a criteria API as you could do with JPQL. And Hibernate would then just execute that SQL statement, and the performance there would be the same. The question is, do JPQL and the criteria API support the right feature set for you to write the query for your use case? And that quite often isn't the case when we are talking about bigger data sets and more complex operations. Then you quite often need more complex query features. And in these cases, it makes more sense to use the native query that I will show you in a bit. What else do we have? Abir wrote, I always face problem while using in clause in JPQL. When the element in clause is more than 1000, there would be error. I'm using Oracle DB. Yes, that's right. And you are facing these issues because you're using Oracle. Oracle has a limit of 1000 elements in an in clause and doesn't accept more. You could do a subselect instead, or split the operation into multiple batches programmatically yourself. Or the third option, if you're selecting by primary key, then take a look at the multi-select API. Let me quickly check if I find the article that I have on that topic. No, I don't find it right now. I will take a look at that later, Abir. I see you posted that question on LinkedIn. I will make sure to post the link to that into the comments on the LinkedIn live stream. And Sasa wrote on Facebook, is an exception will occur in your JPQL if you have two books with title Hibernate, for example, Hibernate Beginner and second Hibernate Advanced. You're parsing in single. Let me quickly take a look at the code. So that would totally depend on the way that I get the result. Yeah, in this case, you're right. So here I'm telling my query to get a single result from the database, and that would throw an error if there are more than one records or books that contain the word title in the word Hibernate in the title. Yeah, on my small data set here, that works totally fine. On a bigger database with more books about Hibernate, that would fail. You're right. So in that case, I would need to switch this to get result list, and then I would get a list of books. Oh yeah, awesome. Multi-identifier load access. That was the stuff that I was looking for. If you take a look at my blog, you will find an article about that. Right now, I don't have the link here, but as I said, I will post it later. So was it Abir? Please take a look at multi-identifier load access. Yeah, and CB wrote the criteria API query seems very verbose. Yeah, that's right. That's one of the main downsides of the criteria API. So as you can see here, it's a lot of code that you need to write to actually generate your query. Then Thorben asks, can we manage transactions in criteria API, such as locking? So first of all, transactions are independent of the way you write your queries. The same is true with concurrency management, which would then be locking. You can define the lock types by providing hints to your query, and you do that in the same way for JPQL and for criteria queries. I think also in the same way for native queries. Not 100% sure. In general, I recommend to not do any locking. It only causes performance issues and should better be avoided. And then Morteza asks, I've used criteria quite a lot, but never query DSL. Is there any advantage, performance, and so on, in using query DSL over criteria? Yes, I think the query DSL API is easier to read. For a while, there was some issue with the development of query DSL. Seemed like nobody was maintaining it anymore. But as far as I've seen, that improved a lot over the last, well, probably already a good year. So if adding another library to your project, I would suggest to take a look at Query DSL if you don't like the criteria API, or maybe to take a look at Juke. Where both of them solve these sort of similar issues. They provide a good API to dynamically create your queries. And a lot of developers like it better than the criteria API. But that, as I said, introduces another library to your application, and you need to integrate them with Hibernate, which is relatively easy to do, but well, you have to do it. Then CB asks, is there a less verbose way of using criteria API? Unfortunately not. And Michael asks, how can you force Hibernate always acquire all logs in the same order in queries to avoid deadlocks? Okay, Michael, please remind me that I will pick that question in the Q&A section. Then Satish wrote, JPA specifications are retrieving all the columns in table that is impacting the performance. Well, that depends on the projection that you use for your query. Here we are selecting all the columns. Here we are selecting all the columns because I'm selecting a book entity. So I tell Hibernate select all columns mapped by the book entity, which usually are all columns in the book table. And I'm doing the same here, but do I have an example here? If not, then I create one. Well, the easiest thing to do is to adjust this JPQL query here. What you could do instead is remove this part, and then it's only a query, and we select the title and maybe the ID. And And then we get an object array back. And that's, of course, not an instance of book. And that also doesn't work. And we need to cast this. Okay. And we're now do log info b0 and b1. And we are selecting a few scalar values and not an entity object. Then you will see that we no longer select all the columns from the database table. We are selecting the ID and the title. So you can adjust that based on what you actually need. Is it possible to create dynamic filtering with criteria builder? I mean, if we have operation type like less or equal or greater or equal, so on, and prop name also be nested property, can we somehow dynamically build root path to prop and set the operation type? We can, well, we have full flexibility here of what we do, right? So we can, let's take this example here. We can write our code in a way that we use the user input to decide if we join from the books to the authors. We can use user input to decide what kind of entity attributes we check in the where clause. We can use user input to decide how to model our select clause. We would do that using the select method on the criteria query if we just want to select one thing, or the multi-select method if we want to select multiple entity objects, so let's say authors and books, or if we want to select multiple columns and so on. So there you can build your query in any way you want. Yeah, totally depends on the Java code that you write around the criteria query parts. Jose wrote, Spring Data JPA also supports specification queries based on criteria API. Do specification queries have any advantage or disadvantage over criteria? Well, I would say they have a main advantage. They are easier to write than and require less boilerplate code than the whole thing that you see here. Besides that, from the top of my mind, I can't remember any limitations that you run into when you're using Spring Data JPA specifications compared to plain JPA with criteria APIs. Zatish just wrote, basically specifications have limitation to select required only columns. Specifications always pull every column from table. Fetching more data than the required is a problem. Well, that depends on the return type of your query. If the repository method returns entity objects, then of course the specification returns all the columns mapped by that entity object. But if you combine that with the DTO projection, for example, then you shouldn't run into that issue. Mabu, nice to hear that Friday evening is a great time in India for such a stream. Highly appreciate that. Yeah, I think Friday afternoon here in Europe. I know it's early morning in the US. which might be a little bit hard for some people to join. Yeah, for us here in Europe or in India or other countries on the Asian continent, this I think is a good way to end this the week. At least hope so. So ZB asks if it's possible to have a table with the pros and cons for each JPQL criteria native. Yeah, I can create that and add that to the post on torbenjansen.com/live, where you find all the live streaming posts. So I can add a quick graphic here after the stream. I have a customer call after this stream, so it might take me a day or two to add that. But if you look at this post at the beginning of next week, you should see an image with the comparison of JPQL criteria and native queries. It's actually a really good idea. Thanks, CB, for the suggestion. Okay, let's take a look at native queries. So now we are back again to a string-based definition of our query, which, as you can see here, is way easier to read, but also not as dynamic as the criteria query, where we were able to really adjust our query statement based on user input or based on some business logic or whatever. So yeah, what's the main difference between this statement here? Select asterisk from book B, where title is equal to the title bind parameter, which is basically the same as we did here, where the only difference is that here we worked on the book entity. And here we are working on the book table. So now we are using the asterisk to select everything. And we select everything from the book table. That actually also includes columns that are not mapped by the book entity, which doesn't happen too often, but in general, that's a difference. Another important difference is that Hibernate doesn't pass this statement. And that's also true for all other JPA implementations. And that is an important difference because if your persistence provider doesn't pass this statement and just sends it to the database, you can do within this statement whatever your database supports. You don't need any support from your persistence provider. That gives you full access to all features supported by your database. At the same time, that puts you into the uncomfortable situation that if you are supporting multiple databases, you need to make sure that this statement is supported by all databases, which can be quite annoying if you are supporting multiple RDBMS and have a query that looks a little bit different with each dialect. But beside that, this is the same approach as we used with the JPQL query, just with a native SQL statement. And you can do named native queries like we did here with the named JPQL query by doing a named native query annotation here, defining the same query, and then calling the create named query statement method here with the name of your named native query. Yeah, so let's sum this up real quick. We have three options to create our queries. We have JPQL statements, we have criteria API, and we have the native SQL statements. JPQL are based on your domain model, very easy to write. You can use all your domain, all information stored in your domain models or mapping information and so on. Criteria API does the same as your JPQL statement, just based on a Java API. Very verbose, but also very flexible. So for all default use cases that are not special in any way, I would say use JPQL statements. They're easy to write, relatively easy to maintain, and provide a good performance. And they're just a general good fit for most use cases. Criteria API I suggest to only use when you're benefiting from the additional flexibility that this API provides you. In all other cases, I would use something else. And then native queries for all complex use cases where you need to be able to use all features of your database, where you want to create a query statement that's really complex, that uses database-specific features or a bunch of functions and all these kind of things, because usually you can't do that using a standard JPQA statement. Okay, then that's it for now in regards to the different queries, kinds of queries supported by Hibernate and all JPA implementations in general. If you enjoyed this part and you want to learn more about Hibernate, then I want to take the chance here right now to quickly plug my live workshops. You can also find on-demand video courses here in the top navigation, but as at thorbenjansen.com/workshops, you can find links to all my live workshops that I'm doing this year. So there's a Hibernate performance tuning workshop in April. There will be a live workshop about Spring Data JPA in June, one about data and communication patterns for microservices in September, and an advanced workshop in December. And yeah, all of them will be live and online. So we are not meeting in person in this year. If your company is looking for a workshop for your team, then there's of course also the option to have a customized in-house workshop. ZB asked in the chat, what about query by example? Query by example is a feature that's officially not supported by JPA. So unfortunately, we no longer have that. We had query by example with Hibernate's proprietary criteria API. Unfortunately, that is no longer supported. So Hibernate's criteria API has been deprecated since a few years, since Hibernate version 4 something, and it will be removed in Hibernate 6. And ZB asked about my point of view about query by example. To be honest, I'm not a huge fan of it. I haven't used it too often myself. I know that quite a few developers like using it. And I know that, at least in the past with Hibernate's criteria API, the results were decent. So there is nothing to say against query by example. It's just, unfortunately, not a feature that's any longer supported by JPA and Hibernate. So Selimia asked, what is about query DSL, how often we should use or avoid it? Thanks. Query DSL is nice. I recommend using it for all complex use cases where your JPQL query is just not powerful enough, where you need this additional flexibility. So yeah, in general, if you like using query DSL and if you're comfortable using it, then go ahead, use it. It's a good library. It makes life so much easier. And Guduri, I will come back to your question about store procedures in a bit. But now let's quickly get into the weekly recap. So what kind of content shouldn't you miss this week on the blog and this YouTube channel? So first of all, I posted an article on the blog about query spaces. A query space is a Hibernate internal thing that tells Hibernate which tables are affected by, or which tables are used in a query. And Hibernate can then use these information to decide which entities need to be flushed, or are there any entities that need to be flushed to the database before the query gets executed. And also which parts of the second level cache need to be invalidated when we are running a modifying statement. Really interesting topic, as I think, an important one. So yeah, if you're into this, then take a look at the article. As always, you find it at thorbenjansen.com/live. There, if you scroll a little bit down, is a list of resources for this week's stream. And there's also a link for this week's video about database migration with Spring Boot. Spring Boot provides a really nice integration of Flyway and Liquibase, which makes updating your database so much easier. Okay, then let's get to the question of the week before we then go into the Q&A part. So this week I have a very common question, or should I say pitfall, in which Joachim stumbled into. So he obviously has a Spring Data JPA repository, and there he wrote a query in which he selects something from the product option table. And in the where clause, he wants to concatenate multiple attribute values to combine that, to do a like expression on that concatenated string. And the idea there is that if the brand name is null, then it should be, then the query should use an empty string in the concatenation. So basically, what he wants to get is, he wants to get the name of the brand, if it's there, and if not, then this is empty, a blank, and then the title of the product, and if it's there, no, that one's always there. So a brand name if it's there, or empty, and then the title of the product and the undertitle, whatever that is. And then we have an issue with this part here. So this Corlesque expression tells the query if the brand name, if the name of the brand is empty, then return, no, is null, then return this empty string. So what Corlesque does is it returns the first value that's not null. The problem is that that only works on the name attribute. What's intended to happen is that if the brand isn't there, if it's a product without a brand, then Joachim wants to use an empty string. But that's not how SQL works. So in this case, we have the path operator, and we navigate from the, what is this? From the product option to the product to the brand. So to one association to the product and to one association to the brand. That generates inner joins in the SQL statement. And where the downsides of inner joins is that if there is no brand for the product, then the whole record will not show up in the result set. So if we want to make sure that we also get product options that don't belong to a brand, we need to split this up. We need to define two left joins in our from clause and make sure that we have left joins when we are creating the whole result set. And then we can use it in the where clause in a Corlesque expression and say, okay, if the name is empty, then please use an empty string. The important part here is not only to use the left join, but also to then work on the alias that you set here. If you would use the left joins in the from clause and still use the path operator here to navigate over the to-one associations, then you would still generate an additional inner join, which again would remove the records from the recite set. Okay. That's about the question for the week. As always, you will find also a link to this in the article on torbenjansen.com/live. Yeah, then there's just one final thing that I want to quickly promote before we go into the Q&A part, and that is my talk next week, Thursday at what is it, 7 p.m. At the JPQL in Bordeaux in France. It will be a free online talk. If you want to learn a little bit more about using Hibernate in complex projects, then feel free to join us. I will announce it again on Twitter over the next few days. And you can, of course, find it on the website of the Bordeaux JPQL. Okay, now let me take a look at the chat. There were a few questions. I remember that there was a question in the beginning where I said, let's postpone that to the Q&A part. Whoever asked that question, could you please post it again in the chat? As you probably saw in between, my system here disconnected from the stream for some reason. And I lost that chat message, unfortunately. Yeah, Tepco, feel free to ask a long question in the chat. I will do my best to answer it. If it's too complex, then I will take another look at it later and get back to you on the Discord channel. Oh yeah, Michael, you asked the question, right? And you asked, can you force Hibernate always acquire all logs in the same order in queries to avoid deadlocks in Galera clusters? What do you recommend? To be honest, my recommendation would be to not use logs. But you probably have a good reason why you're using logs. So what can you do? Well, what you can do is you can set the Hibernate.order_insert and Hibernate.order_update configuration parameters to true. That forces Hibernate to order all insert and update statements and execute them in always the same order. So Hibernate there makes sure that it basically groups all insert and update statements that happen on one table together. And well, by doing that, it also brings the table in a specific order, and that quite often helps. Besides that, there isn't too much you can do that's really effective. No. So my recommendation there would be set order inserts and order updates, but there isn't much else you can do. Sorry for that. Then Guduri asks about information about stored procedures. Then stored procedures. Let me post two links into the chat about stored procedures. So there are two articles on my blog about stored procedure mappings. And there are these. Let's go to this one, switch to the browser. So what you can do is you can, where is it here? You can use the name stored procedure query annotation to define a name stored procedure query. This is a name query, so you have to provide it. You have to provide a name that's used within your application. So when you instantiate the query to reference it, I recommend to use the same name as the stored procedure on your database. Otherwise, just everyone will be confused. And then you define the stored procedure name. And then you define a set of stored procedure parameters. And these can be in, out, and ref cursor parameter types. And you can then use them to create your query. So here you just instantiate a new named stored procedure query with the name calculate that references the query up here. And then we set the parameter x and y, similar as we would do with a normal JPQL query. And then you need to call execute. That's a difference, main difference compared to other queries. Stored procedures need to be executed. And then you can call the get output parameter value to retrieve the output parameter. And the stored procedure can have more than one output parameter. And that's why this approach is necessary here. Then Bold asks, does native query avoid caching? Yes, all queries avoid first and second level cache. The first and second level cache are only used if you, well, the second level cache is only used if you call the entity manager find method or if you traverse an association between two entities. The first level cache is only used on, but it's fully used when you call the entity manager find method or if you traverse a 2-1 association. In all other cases, Hibernate executes the required SQL statement, and when you get back the result set, which has to return entity objects, Hibernate first checks the first level cache, and for each Hibernate iterates through the result set, and for each record in the result set, Hibernate first checks the first level cache, and if the object that represents or maps that record is already in the first level cache, then Hibernate discards that record from the result set and uses the object from the first level cache. If you want to cache query results, then you need to take a look at the query cache. I discussed that in great detail in my Hibernate performance tuning online training, so in the on-demand video course, which you can find on my site, or also in the live workshop that we will do in April. Then DD asked, you had a blog post about Juke and JPA being a match made in heaven earlier last year, but that more or less used native queries. Is there any other way to integrate the two together? No, there isn't. Like, let's say, integrate them together in a way that you could use it with Spring Data or something that's more abstract than low-level binding. Spring Data offers support for Juke. You might want to look into that. But to be honest, I haven't used that. I haven't used Juke with Spring Data together with Spring Data JPA so far. So I haven't tried it. I would say there should be a way to integrate it. Okay, I already answered Michael's question. ZB wrote, does Hibernate now support non-relational databases? No, there was or still is a project called Hibernate OGM, which tries to apply Hibernate concepts to non-relational databases. Yeah, you might want to take a look at that. Yeah, I have no clue how popular that project is nowadays. I played around with it in the past. I found the idea interesting, but the problem with Hibernate OGM is that you apply the same concepts to different kinds of data stores. And by doing that, you're losing to some extent the specific advantages of that kind of data store. And because of that, I always preferred a different approach. Yeah, hi, Lucas. Okay, then we have the long question from Tepco. So he wrote a SQL script to fill a database with random fact data. The script began with function named, and this function is used later in the script to generate data. The script is run by a Spring SQL annotation during text. Okay. After a lot of errors, Spring finally ends up creating a function into my Postgres database under routine folder, and this function is nothing less than my random between. Well, it solved my problems. I can use my function in any SQL file, but I have no idea what led my Spring Boot to create this function. Finally, my question, do you have an idea how Spring Boot can create such a function in a database? Not without taking a look at your SQL script and the overall project setup. So this sounds strange. And well, from the top of my mind, I don't have any suggestions why Spring Data JPA should create that function if you don't have a create function statement in your script. But as I said, I would need to take a closer look at the overall script and the project setup. So Franklin wrote, I was talking to a friend about not using object to map, avoiding using one-to-many and others annotations. Would it be a problem using just ID instead of an object? Franklin, that depends on which JPA implementation you are using. So plain JPA only supports joins via mapped associations between entities. Hibernate also allows you to create a join clause dynamically in your query. And by doing that, you don't need any managed associations between your entities. If you're worried about association mapping, then I would suggest to only use unidirectional associations and to avoid many-to-many associations. If you just use unidirectional one-to-one and one-to-many associations and make sure that you model the unidirectional one-to-one association on the entity that contains the foreign key column, then there's actually nothing that could go wrong. All the pitfalls are either related to bidirectional associations or to the case that foreign key is on a different table and stuff like that, or to many associations in general. All of these pitfalls can be solved, but it requires that you spend some time learning. You and all developers in your team need to spend some time on learning about the different association mappings. And I know that this is not always possible or the preferred approach. So if you want to be on the safe side, just stick to unidirectional one-to-one and unidirectional one-to-many associations. Okay, and then I answer the question from Alex, and then I would say we end this stream and we see each other again in next week. Could we just post stored procedures, please, in JPA? Could we that? That's what I just showed you with the name stored procedure query annotation that we talked about a few minutes ago. So this is standard JPA, and this down here as well. And if you scroll up in the chat, you will find the links to this article and to a more dynamic approach to generate your stored procedure calls. So Alex wrote, if query DSL is generating a lot of selects n+1 issue, is it better to enforce fetch mode to subselect or create custom query using JPQL query? My recommendation there is to use a query with the join fetch clause or an entity graph. So I would usually, well, it depends on the query that you are creating. If you can write it in a JPQA statement, then I would probably do that and use a join fetch clause there. That's by far the easiest approach. And there you just do join fetch b dot authors, and then Hibernate not only fetches the book entity B, but also initializes the association to all authors that wrote that specific book. And that's a pretty efficient approach, as long as the association doesn't contain hundreds or thousands of elements, because then your result just gets too big. And as long as you don't join fetch too many associations in your query, because you always have to keep in mind that you are multiplying the number of records. So you get the book as many times as you have authors who have written that book. And if you now join the reviews to that, then you would get books multiplied with the number of authors, multiplied with the number of reviews for each of these books. And that quite often gets out of control. Yeah, okay, then final question from Mahbub, who recognized that I'm using VS Code. And he asked if it has equivalent to the Eclipse organized imports, Control-Shift-O. Yes, it has. Let me quickly, what do I press this? It's Control-Shift-O. No, it's Alt-Shift-O. So it's almost the same shortcut. It's Alt-Shift-O. And I'm pretty sure you can find it somewhere here by the context menu as well. Yeah, no, it's Alt-Shift-O. Yeah. Oh, let me send this. Okay. Okay. Yeah, thanks everyone for joining. I will be back next Friday with another live stream. I haven't decided what we were talking about next. So if you have any suggestions, this would be a great time to post them in the chat. If not, then I will come up with an idea over the next few days. Yeah. If you have some time to spare on Thursday afternoon or evening or whatever that's your local time at 7 p.m. And 7 p.m. CET, which is UTC +1. We'll be speaking at the Java user group in Bordeaux, virtually, of course. And you can join the talk there, and we will talk about Hibernate performance, basically. So things you should avoid in complex projects and performance critical projects. And here's the link to that page. Yeah, would love to see you there. And then, yeah, you will find another blog post next Tuesday on the blog about migrating your data model, your domain model from monolith to a microservice model, and how to split that up and what you need to take care about there. and a new video on Thursday on the YouTube channel. Thanks all for joining today. Raphael suggested my impression on DataSpike Criteria API. Yeah, we'll think about that. I haven't used DataSpike in too many projects. But yeah, I can take a look at it, and we can talk about that on the stream. Maybe, if not next Friday, then maybe a week or two later. Okay, thanks everyone. Have a great weekend, and hope to see you again next Friday, 3 p.m. CET here on the same channel as you are seeing me right now. So either YouTube, LinkedIn, Facebook, or Twitter, which is Periscope. Okay, take care. Bye.